Okay, today we're going to talk about something big is coming, and again, way too much to talk about, but it does appear there's some things looming on the horizon that are quite stunning, quite large. We fit somewhere on this timeline before this beginning of the 70th week. And we'll talk a little bit more in the future weeks about some of those things that are coming. So let's just look at some of the news. I have some news things that I want to talk about. I have sort of cultural things, a little bit about the economy. I have some Middle East things that I want to talk about that I think just a few things I think are pretty important. And then I think I'm going to go into a little bit following up on the sort of ecumenical convergence that's happening. And again, this is something we talk about each week, is the convergence of events. So let's look at this. This is something that I would consider to be good news. The ACLJ, Jay Sekulo's organization, was able to enter into a consent order with the IRS, in which the IRS admitted that, contrary to what was said in the Obama administration, they had indeed targeted Tea Party and other conservative groups, denying them their tax-exempt status unfairly. I think that's significant that something like that actually happened. The thing that I don't understand, though, and I'll confess to you, this is something that's not something that I can decipher or understand, is why John Koskinen, who went to Congress and essentially was grossly negligent or lying, is still the acting director of the IRS. It makes absolutely no sense to me. And it's about time Republicans got off their rear ends down there in Washington and actually approved some of the appointments that the president has made. But that's just my opinion. Another thing that's kind of interesting is that this collusion with the Russian government investigation and everything, it appears to be pointing, well, let's just put it this way. One of the candidates in the last presidential election has become rather radioactive, and that would be her. It is stunning to me that they're concerned about maybe Paul Manafort made $100,000. There's supposedly that there's an indictment that's been filed, it's sealed, should be unsealed tomorrow. We'll see who Mueller is indicting. I have no idea. I'm not even going to speculate as to who it is. I've heard all kinds of different ideas. I will note that back when the decision was made to sell about 20% of our active enriched uranium reserves to Russia, the Secretary of State was Hillary Clinton. Around the time that this was being considered, Bill Clinton was paid $500,000 to go to Moscow and give a speech by a bank in Russia that's tied to the Russian regime. They then approved the sale. And this is something you need to know, that Hillary Clinton was adamant in almost every case about selling any kind of technology or anything else to any other country, approving it as in her role as Secretary of State, except in this particular case. It also happens that there were about $150 million in contributions made to the Clinton the Clinton Foundation. And I'm not saying that anything happened. You know, it's just one of those things that came about. So pay attention to this. And by the way, when this was done, you know, Comey was head of Mueller was director of the FBI. Comey was part of the investigative team that was, it is, to say that there's a Washington that sometimes appears to be inbred is an understatement in many cases. So this is something also, too. I mentioned that I was put in Facebook jail for a week. I have friends that keep getting put in for sharing certain kinds of articles. This is a individual who this is actually appeared in USA Today on at least on, I don't know if it was in the print edition. It certainly was in the internet edition of USA Today by James Bovard, one of their opinion columnists. And he said, Facebook censored me, criticize your government, and it might censor you too. And what they're finding, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, if you remind me when I get to talk about Saudi Arabia, I want to make a point that relates to this particular thing about government censoring people and using Facebook as the tool to censor them. Because what they're finding, well, listen to this. In June, German police raided dozens of homes across the nation suspected of offensive social media postings and conducted home searches and interrogations, according to the New York Times. Facebook is deleting, could somebody get me some water, by the way? Facebook is deleting 15,000 posts a month in Germany, but the government is threatening a $50 million plus fine unless Facebook suppresses far more comments. Judith Bergman of the Gatestone Institute commented on the German mandate, quote, when employees of social media companies are appointed as the state's private thought police, free speech becomes nothing more than a fairy tale. Or is that perhaps the point? Other European nations are jumping on the suppression bandwagon. British Prime Minister Theresa May last month called on Facebook to remove purportedly extremist content within 2 hours of a government demand, in which case she is changing her name from Theresa May to Theresa Don't. So that's my editorial comment. But what they're finding is that in many, many countries, Facebook is acting as sort of a de facto censor for the government. In Russia, in Pakistan, in other European countries, if the government calls up and says, hey, we don't like what's being posted about the government on Facebook, Facebook is more than willing to go out there and do that. And there was a good article in the Daily Mail the other day. I don't have time to really go into it, but essentially that these tech titans are very powerful. There was did I mention the lawsuit filed by Prager University last week? I couldn't because it hadn't been filed yet. And I'm not a prophet. The Facebook, or Prager University is probably the most listened to non-media outlet channel in the world. I think RT, which is associated with the Russian government, funded by the Russian government. So you need to, if you use RT, just make sure you understand that it probably has a political bent to it. It has some very interesting things on it. I look at it on a fairly regular basis, but you can't believe everything there at face value. But Prager University has had over 500 million views on its YouTube channel. Their motto is, give us 5 minutes and we'll give you a semester worth of information. Now, I think the number's up to around 37 of the Prager University videos have been marked inappropriate content for minors, which means that if parents have put filters on the internet usage by their children, it won't show up in a search. It's very difficult to find. And it's also restricted from certain searches as showing up. And some of these are very, very salacious topics. I mean, just horrible topics like the history of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the history of I think Victor Davis Hanson had one where he talked about the history of World War I and World War II. And that was essentially, I would call it a soft censorship. Now, we haven't had any block, but we just think it's a matter of time, so we're exploring other media platforms. So Prager University filed a lawsuit this week, and it's kind of novel, and everybody says, well, it's a private company. It has the right to restrict whatever it wants, and it does, but it's in this kind of gray area where they're assuming the governmental role of censoring speech. and they're acting at the behest of the government. So, for example, in Germany, the government makes them do certain things. So then it becomes like a government action. So we'll see how that goes. It was filed by Pete Wilson, former governor of California, and that was just filed in San Francisco this week against Google, YouTube, and some others. I'm going to look at this because I don't even remember why I put this up. Oh, I know why. Kent State. I mean, we all love Kent State. We all really love Ohio State this morning, right, after that. And I just want to say, J.T. Barrett is not very good at two-point conversions. I just want that to... So, you know, he may not get the Heisman because of that, but we're grateful for the one-point victory. Why? Because then we don't have a bunch of depressed people at church. Not that that bothers us, but let's just put it this way. Deep into the fourth quarter, there was a change in the entire outlook for the future on the city of Columbus and the state of Ohio in a very short period of time. Do you agree? Yeah. And even though Meyer didn't do certain things that I would have done, he was still able to pull it out there at the end. So we're grateful for that. But at Kent State, they have this Center for Student Involvement, Division of Student Affairs, and they have this thing. You see what they say, looking forward to the civil discourse at tonight's event. This was just about a week ago. Our moderator has so much to offer this discussion, free food. And the title of it is Free Speech or Hate Speech, but it's interesting what they put on there as hate speech topics. For example, no more gays, and women need to serve their man. That's on the left. On the right, it's build a wall. And then the one you can barely see in the back, it says, and these are all hate speech topics, right? So the other one must be a hate speech topic too. And that's you need Jesus. So this is what the official position would appear to be, that someone who says you need Jesus is engaged in hate speech at Kent State University. Just saying. So let's look at the economy. We haven't talked about this, and sometimes I've been, criticized, accused, or people have commented that, everything you say is so negative about geopolitics and that type of thing. And so I'll admit I do. So today I'm not going to talk as much about geopolitics, but I'm going to talk about the economy a little bit, but it's going to be pretty negative too. So just so you know that, because when you live in a town, a city like Columbus, where the economy is pretty good, and there's building going on, and there's construction, and real estate prices are up, it's easy to kind of get locked into that, well, everything's okay. But then you drive around, I go to other cities, I go to other towns, and the economy is not as good in other places. And people are suffering. And that's right here in Ohio or in Indiana. I found this as an interesting graphic, the United Nations of debt, and you can see the larger in the circle here, the larger the section of pie is, the greater the amount of that country's debt. So for example, if you look at global debt is about $65 trillion among all the governments of the world. The United States has about 21% of all the debt in the world. Japan has about 13% of all the government debt. The interesting thing about difference between Japan and the United States is Japan, its own citizens and corporations and banks and everything own about 90% of that debt is owned by Japanese companies or citizens. In the United States, it's probably less than half, which means that you're sometimes subject to what the other government wants. So it also shows the trajectory. If you find this, I think I found this at Zero Hedge, a great financial blog. But again, the warning about Zero Hedge is if you're subject to, suicidal thoughts or depression, don't go there. because it talks about the volatility that's going on in all the markets. This is just sort of on the books debt right now. For example, what the United States has of $20 trillion, 20 or $21 trillion of debt of the federal government, they have unfunded potential liabilities on pensions and other things of 10 times or more of that amount. So over $200 trillion. That's not sustainable. And for example, even little Greece is on a track to where it wouldn't take very long for them to get to where their debt as a percentage of GDP their debt is 260% of their annual gross domestic product. In the United States, we're right around 100%, or maybe a little over 100% of our annual economic output is related to debt. So if we put every dollar made in the United States to debt over the next year, it wouldn't retire all of the public debt of the federal government. That's not a good situation to be in. Eventually something, paying the piper comes to mind. Here's an example. These are just some of the examples of some of the things that are happening in our economy. And this is like from 1960 on. The increase in healthcare spending has gone up. National health expenditures is up 818% over that period of time. Gross domestic product has gone up 168%, but wages over that time are only up 16%. So you see that there's if your wages have gone up 16%, but your healthcare spending has gone 818%, it doesn't work. So it's like your salary went up $16, but you're paying $818 more in groceries. It just doesn't make sense. Here's another one. This is federal student loan debt. And you see since 2010 how it's gone up. And now it exceeds $1 trillion, and I hear about 30% of it is in default. Here's sort of a combined chart of price changes, things that have gone up or down. Like if they go down, they become more affordable. If they go up, they become less affordable. And so at the top here, you have textbooks and college tuition are up 200% over what they were back in, I can't remember the time scale on this. 1990, in the last 10 years, from 96 to 2016. Child care is up, health care is up, food and beverage up a little bit, housing's up a little bit, new cars are essentially flat, household furnishings flat, clothing flat, but you see down here, software, toys, and TVs are much more affordable now than they were. Now, I suppose a cynic would say, well, the reason why toys and software and computers and TVs are cheaper is because we want people to be able to amuse themselves to death while everything falls apart around them. Now, that's what a cynic would say, and I'm not a cynic. I'm only suggesting that a cynic, if I knew one, might say something like that or think it. And then you see here how debt from back in the I think that goes back to about the 1950s, and then all the way up to 2015, how debt has to finance essentially your lifestyle to maintain your standard of living. And I was listening to a video on the way in. It said, average American couldn't come up with $500. 40% of Americans could not come up with $500 in an emergency if they needed it. That's pretty stunning. Current reserve currency. China has announced that they want to start a thing called the petro yuan in the next couple of months. This chart shows how long reserve currencies have stayed in place. The times seem to be getting pretty shorter. It used to be, remember, the central reserve currency that the trade was conducted in back in the 1400s to the 1500s was Portugal, then Spain, then Netherlands, then France, then Britain, and then the United States. And it may be coming to an end. And if it comes to an end, that makes our debt much more problematic than if we're the reserve currency. This is from Zero Hedge. The World Bank's former chief economist wants to replace the US dollar with a single global supercurrency, saying it will create a more stable global financial system. The dominance of the greenback is the root cause of global financial and economic crises, said Justin Yaffu-Len told a Brussels-based policy research think tank. The solution to this is to replace the national currency with a global currency. Russia, and then a couple months ago, there was a meeting of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, in Russia, and Putin said this: Russia shares the BRICS countries' concerns over the unfairness of the global financial and economic architecture, which does not give due regard to the growing weight of the emerging economies. We are ready to work together with our partners to promote international financial regulation reforms and to overcome the excessive domination of the limited number of reserve currencies. Here's an interview with Kyle Bass. He's a hedge fund manager from down in the Fort Worth, Texas. I think he's Fort Worth or Dallas, Texas. He made a lot of money betting against some kind of debt a few years back. I don't remember offhand what it was, but he made his company like $1 billion in a couple weeks. And he has not been heard that much of since. You might remember I played some interviews of him if you were here or where I was teaching previously. And one of his comments was that in terms of Europe, Europe has a lot of problems. And the problem with Europe is, well, he said, Europe, you don't get to blame the mirror because you're ugly. And then he also said, capitalism without bankruptcy is like Christianity without hell. So here's just a short clip of an interview he gave a few weeks ago.
He recognized nations in the United Nations. And China is the largest trading partner of more than 100 of the 180. And so when I think about China moving through a difficult period of time, I can't imagine that that'd be positive for EM. So, and when you look at EM vol is underneath US NASDAQ vol for the first time ever. And we kind of live in the twilight zone, right? I mean, we live in an environment where, you know, we have
European junks lower than treasuries.
We have European junk lower than 10-year treasuries. We have EM vol inside of NASDAQ vol. We have crazy people lobbing missiles in different places. We have a rising power threatening a ruling power. All of these things are happening all at the same time. I wake up each day and say, I don't even realize which world I'm living in anymore. And yet, equities march higher, vol continues to come lower, and the world is moving from active to passive like there isn't a bump in the road right in front of us. And I feel like there's a pretty material bump in the road. There could be a pothole that we might fall in in the near term, and yet we're speeding along at 100 miles an hour. And so there are these, there's a dissonance in the world today that I actually have a hard time putting my finger on.
So that's making you more risk averse than you would be.
Yeah, I think, as you probably know me, maybe I'm cursed, but I'm skeptical by nature.
I think all good macro people have to be, because that's the game.
But when you think kind of 8 years into one of the biggest bull markets in the history of time, is not the time to be adding risk. It's not the time to be going from active to passive. It's not the time to be piling on to what's been working. Because I think, inevitably, again, not the end of the world, but inevitably we could see some really big gaps, right? We could see some air pockets if all of a sudden everyone thinks they can reduce exposure so quickly and they can't. So I think in the next 12 months, we're going to see pretty elevated vol levels. I think vol's the cheapest asset class in the world.
Well, you can find that. You just look on YouTube for Kyle Bass, and there's a good video out. I could play a lot longer clip of it called Off the Cliff. The interviews a number of financial experts some of whom I have a lot of respect for, and none of them were particularly positive. Just that, the other morning I was driving to work in the construction zone out on the 270 on the west side. And, there's orange barrels, there's barriers all over the place, the lanes are narrower, there's accidents all the time. And some guy comes by in this little, I don't know what kind of car it was. He had to be doing 125 down through the construction zone. And that's what Kyle Bass is saying the world's economy is like right now is we're driving 125 in a construction zone with all the warnings and barriers up and chuck holes that we don't know where the potholes are. So at the same time, we have these just kind of bizarre things going on. Like in England, they would say that, well, crime is down. Well, the reason crime is down is because they're not arresting people like they used to for the crimes that they commit. So if you arrest half the people that you used to arrest, crime's going to go down by nature. And it's a pretty good deal, you go now, if you go to the budget time comes and you go to the legislature or the whoever that gives your budget money and you're the police and say we're arresting half as many people as we used to, they'll say, well, you need half the money that you used to do then, right? And it never seems to really quite work that way. This was an headline that I saw in the Daily Mirror that this one doctor, she's getting 50 children, like under the age of 10, a week to do gender reassignment surgeries. This is insanity. How does a culture, we talk about it as it was in the days of Noah, as it was in the days of Lot, so shall it be at the coming of the Son of Man. And I'm like, Lot didn't even have to put up with this stuff. I don't know how, I'm almost without words. As you can see, I'm stuttering around up here, because I'm not sure how to say this with the alarm that it deserves, that we allow this to go on. To our south in Mexico, 2017 on course to be the most violent year in Mexico history due to drug war. But I want you to listen to what they say is the solution and think about what's going on here in America and see if that's 2017 might be the most violent year in Mexican history, one NGO claims. 24,000 homicides between January and September. In the 2011, they had 22,000 homicides in the whole year. Through September, they've had more. And I don't know why the article says it might be the most violent year. It sounds like it is the most violent year already. I mean, it's at 24,000. It's not going to go down. There are no undoing homicides, at least. Well, I don't know. Maybe Benny Hinn will go down there or something, or Todd Bentley. But in 2007, there were 2,828 executions. 73% of the murders committed in the first 8 months were related to organized crime. In 2007, there were 2,828 executions. Now, a decade later, over 18,000 have been reported just this year in Mexico. Gang-style executions. Roll said that drug regulation is the only strategy for dealing with Mexico's violence problem, especially in the drug-producing states of Sinaloa and Guerrero. The legalization of narcotics could lead to prosperity for rural workers. So we'll just legalize it. Then it's not a crime problem, right? And I saw a study this week. Don't send me any hate mail. I know people will send it or make negative comments about it, but among youth, studies show that increasing marijuana use causes psychotic episodes. Now, is this a surprise to anyone? It's sort of common sense, right? But you can't use common sense anymore. And everybody says, freedom and all this stuff. And, It's just crazy. Here's sort of a track of United States drug overdose deaths. Look from 2000 to about 2013, and now there's a spike. Fentanyl is out there. It's it's cheap. My understanding is it's manufactured largely in China, and it's delivered often through the mail because it's hard to trace. And it's a problem. I mean, it's a massive problem here in Ohio. In some towns, they're having an overdose death or more, 1 or 2 a day in just one town. They're running out of supplies of the naloxone that kind of undoes an overdose. And here in Mexico, violent car robberies at their highest point in the country's history. 85,900 insured cars have been stolen. 60% of the robberies were violent. And this seems to be taking place all over the world. So now I'm going to fast forward. I'm going to skip the ecumenical thing for the moment, and we'll look at some geopolitics. So Catalonia says they want to secede from Spain. Spain immediately dissolves their parliament. And so Spain is in a bit of turmoil over this. What are they going to do? Is Barcelona going to be part of Spain, or is it going to be part of a new country? In Italy, there are now wealthy areas in Milan and Venice that want to secede from Italy if they don't get what they want, because they're tired of paying all the taxes to support the people in the South, who they view as not working all that hard. And this is true across Europe. Northern Europeans don't like Southern Europeans because they think they're lazy and they don't work as hard, and their GDP isn't as high. There's some statistics to support that. So Europe seems to be falling apart. Now, I know some people say, oh, well, that's just proof that all this Bible prophecy stuff about a coming one world government or a new world order is just a bunch of bunk. I think it's exactly the opposite, because as these things destabilize, people don't like to live where it's in unstable environments. And what will they do? They will give up some of their freedoms and stuff to someone who comes along and says, I have a solution. So we have to see how this plays out. But I mean, I don't know. I mean, there's a large portion of the Bible prophecy community thinks that a revived Roman Empire will be the final empire. I think it's kind of a mix of some things. Talk about that in a moment, because it's going to be a big military power, and the U.S. seems to be a big military power. I think that's somewhat questionable when you really look at how prepared we really are for certain things, and some of the new technology that's been adopted by our enemies, like hypersonic ship-to-ship, land-to-ship or air-to-ship missiles that we don't really have any defenses for. I know right now we have 3 aircraft carriers around North Korea. That indicates that maybe a war's coming. But don't worry, Pope Francis is here, a celestial debate over Europe's future, and they're going to be meeting at the Vatican. He's sponsoring the meeting about how do we get Europe reunited again. It says, though not a member of the EU, the Vatican will on Friday and Saturday launch into one of the bigger political questions of the years. Quo vadis Europe? Where goes Europe? And we know that there's the Brits are leaving the EU. It says this: last year, Francis received the prestigious Charlemagne Award, awarded yearly by the city of Aachen for his service to European unity. In the Middle East, the city of Raqqa fell, and that pretty much ends the caliphate. There are still a few areas in which they have control. Those would be the orange areas. So you see here in the center part around the border of Iraq and Syria, there's some cities that they still control. Del Azor, up there on the Euphrates River. Mentioned that last week as kind of a significant thing, that the Russians had crossed the Euphrates, which was very significant. There is one place down here on the Golan, Israel-Syria border, where ISIS still has effective control. These blue squares are where they used to have control. Now they only control the orange, and they're falling by the week. And there's been a big push over the last couple of weeks. This is a map of Raqqa and how they've gone in and taken over Raqqa. But look at this, there's no sound on this video, but this is a drone that was taken of Raqqa this week. Now, what's happened is Russia and Syria and some other, Iran has come out and said, oh, look at what those evil Americans did to Raqqa, Syria. They just bombed it to oblivion. But you know, it's hard to tell unless you knew this was Raqqa, like this circular area here with the monument in the middle of it. You wouldn't know that it's Raqqa because it looks like almost every other city of Syria where Russians and Syrians were bombing Sunni neighborhoods to get rid of them. And so it's just massive destruction, and this is true all across Syria. Now everybody's coming in to try to pick up the pieces. In fact, in some neighborhoods, this is from the Jerusalem Post, either Friday or today, at the doors of starvation, Damascus suburbs struggle. In the eastern suburbs of Damascus, kids are starving. Tell the story of a 2.5-year-old child. Child weighs 12 pounds at age 2.5. Because there's no food. There's a mother, she has twins. She tries to breastfeed her children, but she can't because she's so starved herself, she can't produce milk. And it's a major, even today, after things have, supposedly calmed down, it's still a humanitarian crisis. These are, by and large, Sunni areas that Iran and the Syrian government, which leans towards the Shia side of things, want to get rid of the Sunnis. And what have they done? They put them on the road, as one of the NATO commanders said, they put them on the road and sent them to Europe. And now they're destabilizing Europe. In fact, there's a great article in the Gatestone Institute the other day. Let me see if I can pull it up here. I don't even have time in the course of a week to pull up and put into the slides all of the articles that I could get. Now I'll see if I can find this article. This is where everybody turns off the prophecy update because they think I'm finished. And because I'm just standing up here and I don't see it in here. But the article by Miati, his first name begins with a G, he talks about the fact that this is a huge demographic problem in Europe, that Europe is still on track to become Islamic in very short order. And we're talking like in a lot of it in a decade, Islam will be sort of one of the dominant political forces. And what does that make Europe look like? It destabilizes Europe. So we have the geopolitics where people want to leave their chosen country. They want to go someplace else. They want to split up the countries. We have this in Kurdistan, which is oil rich. Iraq's going in. The United States appears to have abandoned our Kurdish allies that we used in the war. It's a big problem. Melanie Phillips has a great article on in the Jerusalem Post on Friday. Real threat to the West. Why can't Britain see it? You should pick that up. People are blind. Now we all know that the free speech movement, what we call the free speech movement here in the United States, had its genesis at the University of California at Berkeley. And University of California at Berkeley, remember that's where Mio Yiannopoulos and Ben Shapiro went to speak. They disinvited Milo, they let Ben come. They spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on security when he came and spoke there last month. They want to bring in Alan Dershowitz. So the Daily Californian put out an editorial a few weeks ago, and this was Alan Dershowitz, and you see the thing, you see the foot here of Alan Dershowitz, and essentially it's a lot of anti-Semitic statements that are kind of wrapped up in this cartoon. You see the stomping on there's somebody under his foot that used to be holding a Palestinian flag here in the lower right-hand corner. Up here, there's the IDF, and somebody has been shot and killed. And essentially, it's saying Jews control the world. That's what it's saying. And they want to kill Arabs and Palestinians. All of this happens. And so that the Daily Californian said, this is no good. We're retracting this. We're sorry we put this up. And the question is, how does this get up in the first place? What kind of standards do they have there that it takes public outcry from outside the university to tell them, you guys got a problem? And it's because they're on the left. They don't think clearly. They're run completely on emotion. And this week is the 100th anniversary. November 2nd, Thursday, will be the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, where, and there's a lot of articles, particularly in the Jerusalem Post this week, about how Balfour came about, what's going on with Balfour currently. And Balfour essentially said, we think the Jewish people, well, you can read it here in the thing. It says, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. Now, we know that was 1917. That was 20 years after really the Zionist movement got started by Herzl in Europe. Jews started emigrating to Israel back to their historic homeland, buying land, and soon became the majority population, to which they continue to be to this day. That led to a number of wars. It led to terrorist attacks down in Hebron in 1928 when about 70 Jews were murdered in the Jewish community there in Hebron. And it's kind of had fits and starts. What happened, though, there's a big war when Israel declared independence in 1948. And as a result of that war, some Palestinians left, became refugees, and they've been kept in refugee status since that time for 70 years. We went to Nablus. You go up on Mount Gerizim, you look down on Nablus, and you can see the Palestinian refugee camp in Nablus that's existed there for 70 years. People, they're forced into that refugee camp. They can't leave because they're political pawns to be used in this anti-Israel campaign. At the same time, Jewish populations in the tens of thousands, even in the hundreds of thousands, in other Middle Eastern countries, Islamic countries, have dropped to virtually zero in that period of time. The Jews have been expelled or forced to leave. Do you ever hear the UN issue a peep about that? Do you ever hear the UN go in and say, we got to compensate the Jews who were forced to leave without their property? It never happens. That is significant. That is what the Bible says will happen in the end times, that all nations will be gathered against Israel, and they'll be hated. And they are, and it's the way it is, and it's the way I think it's going to be until the Lord returns. Israel's working hard to do that. The left here, Jeremy Corbyn, the head of the left Labour Party in England, in Great Britain, says, I'm not going to honor the Balfour Declaration. Why? Because he hates Israel, and he loves Palestinians. This played out in another way in Dubai this week, where they had a judo competition, and this young Jewish Israeli man won the international Jewish competition, or the international judo competition, and this is the ceremony to give him this gold medal. Now, what do they do at gold medal ceremonies? They raise your flag and they play the national anthem, right? So here they start, and you see here's on the left, there's whatever country that is. It's an Islamic country, and here on the right is Switzerland, and that one that's I think Russia, the white, blue, and red. And where the Israeli flag should be, this is what it should look like, is the International Judo Federation flag and the song that they've selected, because it's in a Muslim country and they refuse to play the Jewish national anthem or raise the flag. In fact, the judo guy was on his way, the team was on their way, and they were going to fly, they had to fly through Istanbul, from Tel Aviv to Istanbul and then on to Dubai, because there's no direct flights. But they were told then they couldn't fly that way because Turkey wouldn't give them passage through to Dubai. This happens all the time. There's no outrage. And in the week where the Balfour Declaration is celebrating its 100th anniversary, this thing is playing out on the pages of news things all over the world. Now, this week, this guy, his name is Michael Link. He is a law professor in Canada, and he is a very left-wing law professor. And so he is the United States Special Investigator. They call him a rapporteur, which means reporter. And he's looked at the Israel-Palestine thing, and he's issued a report to the UN. It's been accepted by the UN Secretary General about what they should do with regard to Israel and the Palestinians. And this is a copy of his report, just came out the other day. The Special Rapporteur wishes to express his appreciation for the full cooperation with his mandate extended by the government of the State of Palestine. Now, there is no State of Palestine. So how accurate do you think his report's going to be if he doesn't even get sort of like the basic fact straight right at the beginning? He doesn't. Look at some of these recommendations. In June 2017, Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territory, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, marked its 50th anniversary. This is the longest running military occupation in the modern world. Now, I would suggest that like Cuba is worse, that's been around a lot longer than 50 years. Notwithstanding the insistent calls by the international community, most recently in 2016, that the Israeli occupation must come to a complete end, that many of its features are in profound breach of international law, and that its perpetuation both violates the fundamental right of the Palestinian people to self-determination and undermines the possibility of a two-state solution. Wait a minute, I thought you just said in the introduction that there was the State of Palestine. Oh, but it's a future thing. See, people on the left are confused and they don't even understand it. It has become more entrenched and harsher than ever. Indeed, the Israeli occupation has become a legal and humanitarian oxymoron, an occupation without end. The occupying power cannot impose conditions or create facts on the ground that are designed to establish a claim for title. He goes on, he cites all these different things. Fighting 47, Israel's occupation is 50 years old and counting. The duration of this occupation is without precedent or parallel in today's world. I would suggest like China, right? Has been around more than 50 years. Been around 70. And tens of millions of people have died there, by the way, I might just add. In fact, is he a prime minister or premier of China? He gave a 3.5-hour talk to this combined legislature in China. And someone would said, the Chinese have demonstrated tremendous fortitude, tremendous ability at bladder control, because nobody got up and left apparently. And I'm thinking like, if he can do 3.5, why can't I? So just because I'm not a dictator, that's why. He made some recommendations, recommends that the government of Israel bring a complete end to the 50 years of occupation. He cited an editorial in Haaretz in which he said that only international pressure will end Israeli apartheid. Here's just, I'm going to play couple little clips of him, not the whole thing since we're running a little bit short on time. He did a press conference to support this. Oh, here it is.
Israel has occupied the Palestinian territory for 50 years with no end in sight. This is the world's longest-running belligerent occupation. In my report this week to the Third Committee of the United Nations General Assembly, I examined the question of whether an occupying power engaged in a protracted occupation can at some point cross a red line and thereby become an illegal occupant. I have defined 4 requirements set out in international law by which an occupying power must abide by. 1, the absolute prohibition on annexation of territory. 2, an occupation must be inherently temporary. 3, an occupying power must always act in good faith. And 4, the occupying power must act in the best interests of the protected population. As I describe in some detail in my report, the extraordinary duration of the occupation, Israel's acquisitive and expansionary role in colonizing the occupied territory, the diminished Palestinian economy, and the shrunken space for Palestinian daily life, and the systematic violations of human rights of the Palestinian people, all indicate that Israel has violated these foundational principles. The laws of occupation are very clear that the occupying power cannot treat the territory as its own, nor can it make claims of sovereignty. Yet, this has been Israel's persistent pattern in governing the occupied Palestinian territory for much of the past 50 years. The international community has long demanded Israel to bring a complete and expedient end to the occupation. Instead, the occupation has deepened and thickened. The traditional approaches of international diplomacy have proven inadequate. We need a new toolbox. The tools of declaring Israel as the illegal occupant stands as one of the most effective possibilities of moving this century-old conflict and this half-century-old occupation to a durable and just end.
Well, listen to what this editorial said. He cited it with favor near the end of that clip. And this is what the left-wing Haaretz said, which the special rapporteur, the reporter, the investigator that you saw, Michael Link, that you saw speaking there, said that this was the intellectual newspaper of Israel, intellectual and well-respected Haaretz, I guess, as opposed to Jerusalem Post or something else. And it's a left, because why? He's a lefty and he doesn't understand. He doesn't read anything else. That's why. That's part of the problem. This is what the editorialist Amos Shokin said. The nearly 50 years of Israeli apartheid. This is an Israeli newspaper saying this. The nearly 50 years of Israeli apartheid are not based on security considerations. Zionism, which was always prepared to divide the land of Israel with its Arab inhabitants, was replaced by the godly promise of the land of Israel for the Jewish people. This promise is being fulfilled by constant methodical settlement in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, along with the pushing of Palestinians into defined enclaves in small, crowded population areas. The growing delegitimization of Israel is this country's own handiwork. Should Israel decide to end apartheid, it will return to being legitimate in every respect. Anyone who acts against Israeli apartheid is essentially acting on behalf of the renewal and strengthening of Israel's legitimacy as the national home of the Jewish people and the land of Israel, a secure refuge that enables self-determination for Jews in a Jewish and democratic state. Here's another little clip of his.
When I look at recent statements by the Prime Minister of Israel, he has said on 3 different occasions in recent months, number 1, with respect to Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, Jerusalem is ours, united and forever. So there's no intention of wanting to give up on the illegally annexed East Jerusalem. Number 2, he said at the end of August of 2017, there will be no further uprooting of any Jewish settlements anywhere in the territories. Those are Jewish and those are ours forever. And he said 3 days ago that the Jordan Valley is and will always be Israel's. So it doesn't leave very much left for the Palestinians to want to negotiate, aside from a Bantustan of a strip-thin going from Jenin at the top down to Hebron in the south. So I'm, in terms of what the negotiation position is of Israel, the negotiation position of the Palestinians, which I would suggest is probably relatively close to where international law is, there's a unbridgeable gulf.
Well, he at least acknowledges that the gulf is unbridgeable, but you notice how he threw in there, well, the Palestinian position is closer to international law, and that's just not true. In fact, the best international law case can be made is that Israel's entitled to all of the land west of the Jordan River. And Israel won't give up other parts of it because of why? Security considerations. So for this person, this guy, or the leftist editorial writer for Haaretz to say that security considerations don't enter in is just it's leftist blather. It doesn't mean anything. It's nonsense. It's like white noise. But this is the state of the world that we live in. And the thing that I would suggest to you is that, in Daniel, it talks about that the 70th week will begin when this covenant is confirmed. Now, everybody runs around with their little sound bites and says, well, this is the signing of a peace treaty, but it doesn't say necessarily with who. It will be with this person who's a coming world leader. I don't know that he'll be a world leader at that time, because his true identification won't really be certain until he goes in and desecrates the temple in the middle of the 70th week. And we can argue about that, One thing to keep in mind is I made up this little meme. I haven't sent it around, and I shouldn't. On the left is you have places where people argue about prophecy, and on the right is places where people don't argue about prophecy. And I stand by what I said there, is that they're future events. They're not perfectly clear in Scripture. And so we can talk about it and we can argue about it and that sort of thing. But let's do it with gentleness. So one of the questions asked of this Michael Link guy was, well, my point on Daniel 9:27, I didn't finish. So here's the point. The way the wording is there, it's confirmed, gabar, and that gabar usually means with force. So I'm not certain that this will be necessarily, I'm just throwing it out there for consideration, I'm not dogmatic about it, that this will be something like a big treaty signing like you had with Oslo or anything, but it may be something that the international community will force gabar on Israel. Now, Israel's not going to take it. But that could be the trigger to lead to some of these other things like Ezekiel 38 and 39, Psalm 83, some other wars that will take place, that we know will take place during that 70th week period. But it may be something, and you get the impression that this guy works with the UN, and the member states are interested in doing this, and they want to put sanctions on Israel. And one of the things he said in the talk just before that last clip was, hey, look, Israel's not North Korea, okay? Because Israel needs to trade with other people. North Korea is pretty much, the implication was North Korea is self-sufficient, they can take care of its own people, but Israel needs to trade with other countries or it won't be able to survive. So we might as well put pressure on them. And so then one of the reporters goes, so you're saying boycott? And he goes, I never use boycott in my 10,000 words. Well, you said everything but boycott. I read all 10,000 words, and you can download it. It's on the UN website. But the international community, and we saw this back in the end of the Obama administration, where they put in the resolution, they wanted to force Israel to do some things. So there might be an element of force in there, and it's not all this wonderful ceremonious peace and light thing. That's just a thought on my part, looking at the way the thing, and again, no reason to be dogmatic about it. It'll come about. And then these are the recommendations. Now, at the same time that this is going on, I mentioned this a couple months ago, Saudi Arabia issued a Vision 2030, and everybody's using 2030. Sustainable development goals of the UN. And then Saudi Arabia came out with this publication, you can download it, called Vision 2030. And it starts out in the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. And it goes through and it talks about our vision, and it says here, but this is in the report a few months ago, the heart of the Arab and Islamic worlds, the investment powerhouse and the hub connecting 3 continents. And that's kind of an interesting phraseology of the way they said that. So this week they had it was called Future Investment meeting in Saudi Arabia. And Maria, what's her name, Bartolomeo, from Fox Business, she was the host. And they had the Crown Prince. They had other people like the head of SoftBank, a couple big investment heads. And they all came to talk about how great it's going to be invest in Saudi Arabia. And then the Crown Prince also said, we're going to put in moderate Islam. Now, I personally am very concerned with where this is going, because you see the birthplace of Islam and all the investment people coming there. Why? Because, well, they want to make money, right? I mean, that's what they're about. They're not necessarily about freedom and that type of thing. They're about making money. And here is, the place where Sharia law is enforced, and where one of the most, go find a church in Saudi Arabia. You won't, or if you do, the people will be beheaded pretty quickly. And people are beheaded in public squares all over Saudi Arabia. 6 girls who went out without their parents, went out and were seen with boys, were beheaded this week in Saudi Arabia. And so the Crown Prince gets up there and says, and this beautiful, with the lovely Maria from Fox Business, hey, we're going to put in moderate Islam. Well, what does that mean? Moderate compared to what? By the way, go look up ACT Cleveland, Phil Haney and Jim Simpson. I went down to Cincinnati to see them speak the other night. I think the one from Cleveland was put up on YouTube. Just type in Phil Haney, Jim Simpson, ACT, and you should be able to get a video of what was talked about. And Phil Haney, there is no moderate Islam. It just doesn't exist. And this stuff comes through the mosque. And then Simpson talked about the red-green alliance, communist, leftist, and green Islam, and how they're pushing things through. And I'm very concerned about where all of this is going. And I'll say in a minute, because part of that meeting was the announcement of Saudi Arabia putting in here in the northwestern Saudi Arabia, near Eilat, put a bridge across the Red Sea from Jordan, Saudi Arabia to Egypt, and this giant city called Neom, N-E-O-M. Neo meaning new, and M in the Arabic, it really means future, new future. And this article that I found this morning just by chance on a website called Oriental Review, and you always, again, it's one of those websites where you have to kind of filter through it, but some very interesting observations. And it says, Saudi Arabia might recognize Israel because of Neom. And turn the sound down on this. This is the video, the promo video that was put out about Neom, and how in this area where there's nothing, they're going to invest $500 billion. And this has become sort of the anchor point of their 2030 vision. This will make or break what Saudi Arabia wants to do. But so the city, joining 3 continents, it'll be sort of its own governing entity, because they know they can't do it the way they do it in the rest of Saudi Arabia. But one of the principles of Islam is sort of this, it's sort of what they call in basketball, the head fake. You act like you're going one way, but you go another. And this is what that religion does. It's built into their doctrine. And they make peace treaties so they can become stronger. Not because they want peace, it's just we're not ready to take you over yet and impose Sharia law. It's called a hudna, and they're also allowed to misrepresent what they're doing. That's called taqiyya. And this is all well documented. But the point is that here at this place, to make it work, they really need to have Israel's participation. And so there's been a lot of talk about Israel and Saudi Arabia getting along. This article in the Oriental Review referenced this Med-Red railway from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, Med-Red, and how that would be used, because what they don't want to get into is if they go around the other side of the Sinai up through the Suez Canal, what do they have? They have a major choke point. And this is all part of the One Belt, One Road initiative. Brian Schrager's written about it in the Jerusalem Post. We've talked about it here. There's some good articles at Oriental Review about it, talking about this from a few years ago, how China wants to establish this trade through the Middle East. And this is all part of, this is one of the big final links of the road. Now, okay, so fine. That's just fine and dandy. What happens? Listen to what this article says. The Gulf of Aqaba was chosen not just because it would allow neon to spread into Egypt and Jordan, but also because of its proximity to Israel, which is promoting its Red Med Railway proposal as the perfect Mideast complementary component of the new Silk Road. Tel Aviv keenly knows that the Chinese are always looking for backup plans and transport route diversification in order not to be too dependent on any single connectivity corridor. And in this case, overland rail transit from the Gulf of Aqaba to the Eastern Mediterranean via Israel comes off as exceedingly attractive to Beijing strategists. Furthermore, China has fantastic relations with both Saudi Arabia and Israel. So from Beijing's perspective, this is the perfect Mideast win-win. Now, does this have anything to do with Bible prophecy? Let me make this suggestion. I don't know if this is going to come about, but when you read through Ezekiel 38 and 39 and analyze it, what you find is that Sheba and Dedan are kind of sitting on the sidelines. So while this is going on down here, and Saudi Arabia, Sheba and Dedan, and we know that the areas of Moab, Ammon, and Edom are sort of somehow excluded from all this thing with the Antichrist. But at the same time, up on the northern border of Israel, we have Russia and Iran and Hezbollah and the Shiites planning something. And Saudi Arabia is pro-Sunni and anti-Shiite. And so they've been pumping a lot of money into Syria to oppose what Russia and Syria are doing there. They don't like the Syrian regime because it leans towards the Shiites. They really are at odds with Iran. And I'm only suggesting to you that when the passage in Ezekiel says Sheba and Dedan are down there saying, hey, why are you guys coming down here to take us? What are you doing? It sounds like Saudi Arabia, Sheba Dedan in that part, is sort of on the side of Israel and against what's going on up in the northern part of Israel that's described in Ezekiel 38 and 39. I think the scenario fits stunningly well into the description of Ezekiel 38 and 39. Go read Ezekiel 38 and 39 today and look for Sheba and Dedan and how they react to this, what appears to be this invasion coming from the north onto Israel, from the mountains of Israel, which is where Russia and Hezbollah and Syria, well, Syria is not really mentioned in that whole scenario. It's not mentioned in that scenario. So then what happens? Well, maybe Isaiah 17 happens before. And Russia's been pretty accommodating to Israel, letting them go up and bomb certain positions. And that also, I think, fits into the scenario, because what does it say about if Russia's the head of this coalition that comes? It's drug in. I will put hooks, not one hook, hooks. I'll put hooks in your jaw and drag you in. They may be a sort of a reluctant participant in this. All I'm saying is that week by week by week, these scenarios play out in geopolitics that make the Ezekiel 38 and 39 scenario even more plausible, more soon to happen than we thought. Now, can Saudi Arabia get the $500 trillion investment that they need to build NEOM? They've got a lot of cash. And you've seen some of the major investment bankers of the world already fully on board with it. They went there to be part of this with the Crown Prince, and he promises to bring in moderate Islam at the same time. And so they bring in this, lovely American business news anchor to host this gathering. And so it gives all the appearances of this. But my concern is, and I could add onto this, I don't know if you've read about Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. This is the type of thing that, and there are even some, I was reading this morning, they wanting to denominate them in barrels of oil, Bitcoins and cryptocurrencies. And my concern is, what happens if somebody that wants to put Sharia law in place gets hold of all of these levers of power and mechanisms? I mean, do you think Google and YouTube and Facebook is going to stand up to Sharia? They're already doing it. They're deleting what they perceive to be anti-Islamic or anti-Muslim articles and posts like crazy and putting people in Facebook jail. They're already doing it. You're put in virtual jail. Does real jail follow virtual jail? I think it's hard to make an argument that it doesn't. And so I see all of these things converging under the guise of, economic development and great possibilities and uniting the world and bringing the world closer together. But we know that prophetically there's a dark side to this. So I think you need to pay attention to this. And all this is happening the week that they celebrate the 100th anniversary of Balfour. Well, I have a very long segment about Kenneth Copeland and what he said last week and what happened this week in Kansas City and how it all ties together. And I think it's pretty good. But I'm not going to do it today because we're way over time. So I'm going to I'll try to record it this week. It will be as homework, you should go home. Tim Worth and I did a video 3 years ago when I was in California called Stream of Ecumenism. I know a lot of you have seen it. If not, you need to watch that because it ties in how the Roman Catholic Church, we see them trying to put together this thing about, getting order in Europe, hosting that at the Vatican this week. And the way the New Apostolic Reformation, the NAR people, and some evangelicals are joining, I don't know how else to describe it, joining forces with the Vatican. In the week, that's not only the 100th anniversary, that's Thursday of the Balfour Declaration, but Tuesday is the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. And all this is converging. And so that's why when I started this, I said, something big is coming. I don't know when. I don't know exactly what. I know that I understand bits and pieces of it. It's like a giant puzzle. And I've never been a big fan of those little tiny pieces, because inevitably I would get them all turned over and then somebody would knock them on the floor and I'd have to turn them over again. And I just didn't have the patience to sit there and put those jigsaw puzzles together that took the 12-piece kids that my nieces and nephews used to have when they were 2. I love those. I got those. But it's the 5,000 piece ones, that people work on for a month. I don't have any, it's just not my thing, okay? But I think right now, if I could use the 5,000 piece jigsaw puzzle analogy, what's one of the first things you try to do? Get the corners and the border. And then I think we're filling in the border. Pretty soon we're going to start filling in the inner part of it. And we're going to be able to put together all of the different pieces that are scattered throughout Scripture. It may not be what we've always thought. I think being dogmatic about it is state your case, but it shouldn't become an article of faith, I guess is the point that I'm trying to say. Let's argue about it, let's discuss it, and let's look at it as we fill this picture in, because it's kind of exciting. And again, I apologize for not, I saw one of my friends spoke at a prophecy conference recently, and he posted on his Facebook page, well, I just finished rehearsing all my slide timings for my presentations at this conference. And I'm like, who does that? I mean, who rehearses? Now, you may not believe this. I don't rehearse this. I have no idea how long it's going to take. Okay, I just throw a bunch of stuff together. Sometimes while I'm standing up here waiting for the thing to cycle through so I can start. And it used to be I had 2 minutes. Now I only have 20 seconds. So at least they're putting the brakes on me back there. And they're trying to figure out how to put it. Don't do it because I'll use it. Just don't tell me. Just even if you do it, don't tell me because I'll just keep adding slides. So I will try to, if I have time this week. If not, I will do it next Sunday. This thing that went on in Kansas City and how it all ties to it's the carry-on from what I did in the Stream of Ecumenism video. And I'm telling you, here's the money quote from Kenneth Copeland. We don't need to worry about doctrine, he said. And all the leaders that were there, nobody said a peep. And that's the dividing point. And boy, I saw somebody posted a thing, hey, what do you think of Joel Osteen on a Facebook group that I belong to? I mean, like 300 comments later, and there's like a couple dozen comments in there. Oh, you shouldn't judge poor Joel. He's doing the best he can. He's not speaking untruth or anything. It's stunning to me. Saw a long post this week about Ann Voskamp, who's now spoken, she spoke at Moody in February of 2016. Steve Mitchell did before she spoke at Moody, he was warning about what she talks about. She spoke at Moody in February of 2016, and a week later spoke at Liberty University in their chapel, their convocation they call it. And this year she went back and spoke twice at a women's conference and in chapel. And they have a big conference in D.C. last year, and she's identified, along with Ravi Zacharias and Sean McDowell, as one of the apologists for the Together 2016 conference in Washington, D.C. I've excused myself from not doing it, and I've taken it's much longer than that. So, but watch Stream of Ecumenism and just pay attention to what's going on. Let's pray. Father, Lord, I pray if there's anybody listening that doesn't have the hope that comes with having trusted in Jesus Christ and his finished work on the cross for their salvation and forgiveness of sins, that you would lead them to those places. Lead them to us, have them contact us, lead them, good Christians to them, to share the hope of the gospel with them this week. Pray you'll bless us all this week. In Jesus' name, amen.